Hey guys, so welcome to your first lesson in our unit on ecology. And since this is our first ecology lesson, we might as well start by defining the term ecology. So ecology is the study of the interaction between living organisms and other living organisms, but it is also the study of the interaction between living organisms and their environment. So the study of the interaction between living organisms and other living things, but also the interaction between those living things and the non-living world that they live in. So we're going to start with this first slide here, which shows various levels of ecological study and how living organisms relate not only to each other, but to the non-living environment that surrounds them. So we will start down here, we'll go big to small, and we'll start at the smallest level, at least for the terms of ecology. Remember in our previous lessons we've gone below the organism and talked about organization of groups of cells and organs and organ systems and cells themselves and even atoms and molecules, but today we're going to start at the level of the organism. So an organism is defined simply as one individual living thing. So here's our one individual living organism that we are talking about. And as the little description under the term organism suggests, the primary two goals of any living organism are to survive just long enough to reproduce. And we're going to talk a lot more about that idea later on in the year, but for right now you need just to know that an organism is a single living thing. As we work our way up to the next level of ecological organization, we come to what is called a population. And we're going to talk more about population dynamics later on in this unit. Right now you just need to know what a population is. So a population is a group of organisms all from the same species but all living in the same area. So here we have our one individual living organism, okay? But we have it surrounded by other organisms from its same species, all living in this pretty tight geographic space together. Okay, so a population is simply individual living organisms all belonging to the same species and all occupying a fairly close geographic area, all living very close together. As we work our way up to the next level of ecological organization, it is called a community. And as this right here suggests, this description of a community is simply it's different populations that occupy the same area. So not only now do we have this population, but we're introducing new living organisms not from the same species but living in the same area. So you can see now we have a different organism here that looks like an owl. Okay, up here we have some type of predatory bird. Back here it looks like we have some sort of organisms that are grazing off in the distance. And let's not forget the plants. Right? We've just been talking about animals, but here are other living organisms that we're now focusing on. So a community is lots of different populations of living organisms interacting with each other. So instead of just all the same species living in the same area as we saw in a population, a community is multiple different species living in the same area. As we work our way up one step further, we come to what is called the ecosystem, and there is a major addition that occurs in an ecosystem that we were lacking in a community. Okay? We will talk more about this energy flux and cycling of nutrients again later on in this ecology unit. Here's what you need to know about an ecosystem right now. An ecosystem is a collection of communities, right? So we have organisms from lots of different species all living in the same area. So it's a collection of communities, but we're adding in non-living features of the environment as well. So the ecosystem level is very important because we add in the non-living parts of our planet. So here we have like fire, right? That is considered non-living, but that fire and the smoke that's rising into the atmosphere do have effects on the living organisms that are in that ecosystem. We also have, looks like a storm cloud, right? And that storm cloud is producing lightning and is producing rain. So we have certain non-living elements that are creeping their way into our discussion now, but it's important to recognize that those non-living features have an effect on our living organisms. So when we get to the level of an ecosystem, we're no longer just talking about living things, but we're talking about the non-living components of their environment that are having some sort of impact on them as well. And then lastly, we get to the upper level of ecological organization known as the biosphere. And the biosphere, we're talking about all ecosystems across the entire globe interacting with each other through various processes that we'll discuss here a little bit later in the lecture. But essentially, guys, the definition of the biosphere, you need to understand that it is basically all parts of Earth that are capable of supporting life. So whether it's somewhere on land, whether it's somewhere out in the middle of the ocean and water, or even up here where the wispy clouds are, up in the air, the land, the water, the air, everywhere on our planet that supports life is considered part of the biosphere. So please familiarize yourself starting down here at the level of an organism and working your way up to the top level of ecological organization known as the biosphere. Please familiarize yourself with what makes each one of those steps along the way unique compared to the last one. That's very important for you to understand moving on. So now we're going to focus in on a level of ecological organization that was not a part of the previous slide. And actually, if I go back, if I just sneak back here really quick, when we talk about what's called a biome exists right here in between the biosphere and the ecosystem. Okay, so our next slide, and I'm so sorry for how terrible this looks. But our next slide, we're talking about biomes, and this is the region right here where they fit in. They're somewhere between the biosphere and an ecosystem. So let's go ahead and go on to that next slide. And here is a map that shows our entire globe and the various biomes that exist across it. So what you need to know first and foremost is the definition of a biome. A biome is just a group of ecosystems that all have the same climate. So we're talking about lots of different ecosystems that occur pretty much at the same what we call latitude, and latitude just means these lines across the planet. So biomes typically exist right around the same latitudes as each other, but they're the same ecosystems that have the same climate across the globe. So now we're kind of zooming out to a global level. And you can see down here in this little key, there's a few different biomes that you need to familiarize yourself with of all different sorts. And you can see that they do tend to group up together in certain latitudes across the globe. So if we look, for example, at the first one here, the tropical forest, you know, that dark green color, we can see that dark green color basically occupying this central portion of the globe, right? There's other things. There's other colors, there's that tan, and there's these blues, and there's some other colors in that region I just circled, but you don't see that dark green color that represents tropical forest very far outside of that region. Similarly, if you look at something like the coniferous forest as opposed to the tropical forest, that kind of blue color, we see that blue color again across the globe, but basically around the same latitudes, because its ecosystems occupying the same climate. So when we're talking about northern Canada and then all the way over here into northern Europe and Russia, we know that those have similar climates and they're similar ecosystems. They're just separated by great distances across the globe. So here's just a map of our global distribution of biomes, and you'll do a little bit more research and things like that on these specific biomes as we get further into the unit. And lastly, we're going to spend a little time here in the lesson and then also some time later on in the week studying these crazy looking diagrams that are known as climatograms. So climatograms show the climate of a particular biome or a particular region. But before we zoom ahead and talk about these climatograms, let's rewind here for a second and talk about what the climate of a region actually is. Climate is defined as the average temperature and precipitation of a given area over a very long period of time. Okay? Now, a lot of times people confuse climate and weather. When we talk about weather, we are talking about the condition of Earth's atmosphere at a specific place at a very specific time. Right? So the weatherman on the Channel 9 News every night is talking about the specific condition of the atmosphere over Denver, for example, today or tomorrow or maybe within the next week, but a very small window of time is weather, whereas climate we're focusing on really two major things. Climate we're focusing again on precipitation, and we're focusing on temperature on average over much longer periods of time. And these climatograms that you see here, and you're going to get tons of practice reading them later on in class, but these climatograms show exactly that. They show the relationship between the climate, or excuse me, between the average temperature and the average precipitation over an entire year. So we're starting down here with J meaning January, and we're ending all the way over here in D meaning December. So we have an entire year represented on these charts. And then what you see is kind of a weird combination of a line graph and a bar graph all on the same graph, all in the same space, which is a little bit odd, I know. So let's kind of break this down quick, and then we'll analyze these different climatograms. So if you look right here, it says degrees Celsius, which means that this set of numbers is representing a temperature, okay? And that temperature is shown by this line. So the line part of a climatogram is showing temperature. Whereas over here on this other axis, you see a unit of millimeters. So these numbers right here are representing millimeters. And what those millimeters are is the average millimeters, the average height, if you will, of precipitation that the area received over a year. And those precipitation marks are represented by these bars. Okay, so the lines are representing temperature, whereas the bar graph portion of these climatograms are representing precipitation. And again, it's average over the course of an entire year, going from January all the way to December. Okay. Now, with that being said, let's look at these specific climatograms that we have pictured here and try to figure out a few things just by reading them. Notice, first of all, where they all actually are pointing to. Okay, don't focus on where the graph actually is, focus on where the line is. Okay, all of these climatograms, and I won't circle all of them, but they're basically in this region right here. Okay, they basically occupy this almost central part of our Earth, of the globe, and you'll see this very important line crisscrossing right through the middle of that box that I just made, and obviously at 0 degrees latitude, that is called the equator. Okay, that line right there is known as the equator. Okay? And in fact, there's a certain range that exists on either side of the equator, either to the north or to the south of the equator, and we typically define it kind of as, we see 20 and 40 degrees here, but if I draw a line right down the middle, we typically say between 30 degrees south of the equator and 30 degrees north of the equator. Sorry, that's not really the perfect line, but we typically say this region right here, 30 degrees south and 30 degrees north of the equator, we call that a tropical area. Those are the tropics. So when you go on a tropical vacation, you know, you're typically talking about, you know, somewhere around here in the Caribbean, or maybe the Caribbean, or maybe Florida, down here in Mexico, or Central and South America. We call those tropical, you know, vacation places because they're in the tropics. They're between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. But here's what these climatograms can tell us about tropical locations. Okay, these are all tropical locations we're looking at here. Notice at tropical locations, first of all, they're all fairly close to the equator, which means they get fairly consistent sunlight all year round, which means their temperature in general is pretty stagnant. Even though we have some slight spikes and things like that, these lines are relatively flat. I know they're not perfectly flat, but those temperature lines are all relatively flat because they get relatively the same amount of sunlight every year in that tropical region. Okay. Also notice areas that are north of the equator, so like this area right here, we get an upward spike in the summer months in temperature, just like here in Colorado, it gets hotter in the summer, whereas somewhere that's south of the equator, like this area right here, we get a dip in the summer months in temperature because it's not their summer. Those middle months of the year are actually their winter, their colder time. So a spike in temperature tells us we're somewhere north of the equator, whereas a dip in temperature in those summer, what we consider summer months, actually represents a place south of the equator. Okay? And then another thing to notice is the precipitation patterns, and that the precipitation tends to spike in those warmer months, right? So we have a really high amount of precipitation in those warmer months in these areas that are north of the equator. Notice these spikes in precipitation. Whereas our high precipitation points in the areas south of the equator tend to be not during the summer months, but what we would consider our winter months. Okay? If we look at one more example, now these are all places that are outside of the tropics regions. These are places that are all, in this case, above 30 degrees, and we call, if you're outside the tropics, we call that a temperate zone. And notice the pattern here of the temperate zones. They have huge spikes in temperatures in the summer months. Okay? And they also have fairly consistent precipitation. They have high levels of precipitation, but all fairly consistent. Guys, these are patterns that we're going to focus on as we get further into class, but for right now, just familiarize yourself with these climatograms.